Today we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. First of all, we need to look at the quadratic formula, and if we write our equation in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, then we know ABC and we can plug it into our formula, which is x equals a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. This b squared minus 4ac, later on we will talk about, that is the part of the quadratic equation that we call the discriminant. First of all, our first example is 8x squared plus 11x plus 2 equals 0. So we just plug our values in the quadratic equation, and when we do the math, we end up with minus 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 minus 64 divided by 16. Continuing to simplify, we get a negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 36, all divided by 16. Then we have a negative 10 plus or minus 6 divided by 16. Continuing to go ahead and simplify, a negative 10 plus minus 4, in other words, we're going the top route, is a negative 4 divided by 16, which reduces to negative 1 over 4. If we go the bottom route, which is our negative 16 minus 6, we get a negative 16 over 16, which is a negative 1. Our second example then is to solve x squared minus 2x equals 8. So we subtract 8 to both sides and we end up with x squared minus 2x minus 8 equaling 0. Again, plugging it into the quadratic equation, we have our 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 32, all divided by 2. Then we go to continue simplifying, and we have 2 plus or minus the square root of 36 equaling 2. All divided by 2. So we know the square root of 36 is 6, so now we're going to go the top route, 2 plus 6 divided by 2, which is 4. Or the bottom route, which is 2 minus 6 divided by 2, which is a negative 2. Continuing on, we have an eighth, a squared plus a plus 1/4 equals 0. Well, I don't want to work with fractions, so I'm going to multiply by the LCD, which is 8. And when I do that, I get a squared plus 8a plus 2 equals 0. Plugging that in our quadratic formula, and then we continue to simplify. Under the radical, I have 1 minus 8, which is a negative 7. We know when we pull the negative out, that gives us I. So our final answer ends up being a negative 8 plus or minus I times the radical 7, all divided by 2. This is the discriminant that I mentioned earlier in the video. If we do that b squared minus 4ac and it's positive, there are 2 real solutions. If it equals 0, there is 1 real solution. And if it's negative, there are 2 complex but not real solutions. Continuing on, we're going to use the discriminant. Our first example is m squared plus 6m plus 9 equals 0. Then we have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9, and that does equal 0. Then the equation has 1 real solution. Doing the same thing for x squared plus 5, plugging it in, we have 0 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5, and that ends up giving us a negative 20. Well, then the equation has 2 complex but not real solutions. And then our final example on this page is 3x squared minus 5x minus 1 equals 0. We plug that in, the discriminant formula. We end up with a negative 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times a negative 1, and that's 37. Well, then the equation has 2 real solutions. Another problem is a rock is thrown upward from the top of a 300-foot building with a velocity of 10 feet per second. The height above ground, h, in feet of the object after t seconds is given as h equals a negative 16t squared plus 10t plus 300. So we're asked, how long will it take to strike the ground? Well, what is the height at the ground? It is 0. So we set h equal to 0 and go ahead and solve using our quadratic equation. We plug those in and we end up getting a negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 19,300, all divided by negative 32. So when we do the math, we end up getting 4.7 seconds.